guys, today we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is Ebola. Okay, that came out wrong, but the story behind it is near and dear to my heart, but we'll get to that later. So I'm sure you're thinking, I've heard enough about Ebola, aren't we over Ebola? But I'm sure you don't know all the little details, so that's why you're going to stick with us today, and we're going to talk about it more. So Ebola, as you may probably know, is a virus, which means it's not alive. If we go back down through our characteristics of life, there are a lot of things that viruses have that living things also have, but it doesn't fulfill all the requirements. If you're not sure what they are, you can go back and watch that video again, which I will link here. Okay, so back up. Ebola virus particles have inside them at their core a viral nucleocapsid, and it's going to be a helical structure of RNA. So remember, that's single-stranded genetic material, not our DNA, which is double-stranded and has deoxyribose and uses a T instead of a U. You can check out DNA video later too. And it's wrapped around viral proteins. So there's going to be more information about that linked at the bottom of the video, so if you're interested in its structure, there are people who are working on the Ebola genome. So Ebola used to be known as Ebola hemorrhagic fever, which meant basically that you bled out all your orifices and it was super gross. Unfortunately, the Ebola cases that we're seeing now don't present quite that way. The mortality rate is actually going down. People used to say it was up to a 90% mortality rate, which is really, really bad, but now we're saying anyway from 25% to 90% depending on the case. Now we're going to talk about the most recent outbreak, the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, because that is why I'm wearing these fancy Ghanaian clothing, but I wanted to back up to the origin of Ebola first. Ebola was very first discovered or reported in 1976 when we had two outbreaks that sort of happened around the same time. Now these were in Central Africa and much more remote places, sort of jungly. So how do you get Ebola? If somebody else has Ebola, you can do human-to-human transmission with direct contact. So that's broken skin, mucous membranes, with blood and secretions, through other bodily fluids of infected people. You may hear about healthcare workers getting Ebola a lot, and that's because they're in direct contact with these patients who have a lot of secretions that have a high level of the virus in them, and this occurs through close contact of the patients where the protocols are not strictly observed. Now it's very difficult to treat Ebola patients. You have to be in this very tricky to deal with protective gear. It's very, very hot, especially in the places where the outbreak is occurring in West Africa, and if you're putting on all this extra gear, it's very difficult to work in that. You're sweating a lot, you're very tight, you can be in the suit for many, many hours, so putting it on and off is very tricky, and there's a lot of mistakes that can be made. Now, there are people who survive Ebola, but they remain infectious as long as their blood contains the virus. Now, the 2014 outbreak started in Guinea, which is a country that I know well as I spent 2 years living there, hence this beautiful Ghanaian outfit. Now, Guinea is a beautiful country. Unfortunately, it's very poorly developed. The infrastructure is not very good and the roads are very tricky to get around. But the virus was spread very quickly through people traveling from place to place, especially with dead bodies. Now this care and traditional ways that dead bodies were treated was often leading to a lot of the virus being spread. Our very first case of Ebola, our patient 0 for this particular outbreak, scientists think was a 2-year-old boy who was living in the forest region of Guinea. They think he must have ingested a bat or been playing with a dead bat, which is a very common way for how Ebola gets from animal to human. Now, if you do have Ebola, some of these symptoms will include a fever, sweating, muscle pain, weakness, diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain. Unfortunately, all of these are symptoms of a lot of other diseases as well. And when people started coming down with Ebola in these particular areas, unfortunately, they didn't go to the health centers, maybe if they had a different disease. So people who might have had malaria were going to the health centers to be treated for those things, which people are also working very hard to eradicate. So it turned into this very tricky cycle. People didn't want to get treated because if they found out they had Ebola, they'd be sent away to an Ebola treatment center away from their family where they would possibly go to die. It's very sad. There were also accounts of villages turning doctors and international aid workers away because they had become so good at predicting where the disease was going to go. They actually often showed up before there was a large-scale outbreak in a particular area. Therefore, when people saw these health workers coming in ready to help, they often associated that with them bringing the disease. So there was a lot of pushback in that respect as well. People who recover from Ebola have antibodies in their systems that last for up to 10 years, which is pretty cool. Okay, now most people are kind of over the Ebola US scare, but let's talk about how you can't get Ebola. You can't get Ebola through the air, you can't get Ebola from water, and you can't get Ebola through food unless you're eating a bat that has Ebola. But most of us don't eat bats. Most major scientists and health workers conclude that Ebola poses no significant risk in the United States. Now, if you're traveling to West Africa in the near future, just be careful and be sure to follow all normal health and hygiene practices, like washing your hands and not, licking up somebody's blood or wound. That would be a good idea. Just don't do that anyway. Now let's talk about this vaccination. Now, an article that was published in The Lancet this past week, we actually have reports of a clinical trial, phase 3 of clinical trials, being 100% effective for this special type of vaccination. Now that's great news. A lot of people have been partnering together to work on this, and we think we might have this very, very positive looking breakthrough in combating the virus. Now, it doesn't mean we are home free. What is really important with these types of outbreaks is that we get better at identifying them sooner, and we get better at preventing their spreads. And the more people who can partner on this together, the faster and more efficiently we will be able to solve these problems. All right, thanks for listening.